We're really lucky today to have three of our authors here. Renee, one of Australia's absolutely leading macroeconomists, professor at the Australian National University, and somebody who knows an awful lot about, I think she became famous initially because of the work she did on the Asian financial crisis and the way in which that spread across the world. Is that a fair thing to say, Renee? Come on. Craig, the Honourable Dr. Craig Emerson, you'll know at the far end, former Federal Minister for Trade and Communications, one of Australia's most senior and most trusted, I think, trade economists. Did his initial work on the resource rental tax, which is obviously very much back in fashion now, heavily involved in Asian issues and runs his own business providing advice to companies on Asia and the rest of the world, I think, too, Craig, is it not just Asia? Yes, thank you. And Andrew Parker, we have here, who wrote another one of the chapters in the book, and he's a partner and the Asian practice leader at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He's also a member of the advisory board of the Asian Society. So what I was proposing to do was to actually to ask Renee to lead off, because she thinks about the global perspective and where Australia fits into that. And then we talk to Andrew, I think, about some of the particular difficulties of working in Asia, and Craig hopefully will sort of bring it all together and give us all the solutions. So we might start with you, Renee.
Just from here?
Yeah, from there.
Thank you, Rod. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you all today, and thank you to CEDA for inviting me to write this submission to the document. When Nathan first asked me to write this, I thought it would be a piece of cake. There must be a lot of work already been done on this topic, but when I started to look around, there really was very little work done. So I think one of the things I would like to see come out of this is that someone needs to go and do some research on this area a little more to understand the factors for Australians investing abroad and whether or not it really is a good idea. But first, I was asked to write about outbound investment and the macroeconomy. So obviously that's going to be a global issue. So I wanted to look at some of the global risks and opportunities that exist at the moment in the foreign investment environment. So we've had quite a tumultuous last decade. We've seen the European sovereign debt crisis, the global financial crisis. Things have changed a lot in our economic structure since then. So one of the major challenges that has arisen since that period of time is what Larry Summers has termed secular stagnation. So we're seeing really slow investment growth. It's not increasing at all. At a very fast rate anyway. We have this huge productivity slowdown that comes with that. And this has sparked fierce debate, especially in the US, about what the causes for this productivity slowdown and secular stagnation are. So I've kind of synthesized some of those for you today. So the chapter title was Outbound Investment, not Outbound Investment in Asia. I know that after this we're probably going to be talking a lot about Asia, and I'll get to that a little later, but I think first we need to understand that global context, especially as we do mainly invest in the US, the UK and New Zealand. So one of the first reasons that has been given for the productivity slowdown and the secular stagnation that we see is that the natural rate of interest, or the interest rate that would generate full employment while equilibrating savings and investment, is just historically low. It's in a lot of countries, including Japan, almost the US, although improving, in Europe, we've seen near zero interest rates. So this makes it really difficult for monetary authorities to stimulate any production. Another reason given for our predicament that we have in the investment environment is the effect of technological progress on different industries. So the effects of technology have led to inequality. So industries that have benefited are things like communications and entertainment, but other industries such as manufacturing have been left behind. And this has generated quite a deal of inequality. We see this especially in countries like the US. We see the policies and the political response to that in the election of the Trump administration. And this is just going to exacerbate into the future as the different regions are not developing at the same rate. The inequality will cause a slowdown in investment as well. We also have the liquidity trap argument that Krugman first advocated during the Asian financial crisis. The liquidity trap is where monetary authorities, they just can't reduce interest rates enough, that people aren't actually responding. They just basically accumulate their savings, so they're not being put into productive use. The liquidity trap used to be thought to be a temporary phenomenon. Now people think of it as a permanent phenomenon. So we're not seeing inflationary expectations generated to get out of this in much of the world. Ben Bernanke is a little more optimistic. He has a more global view. He's not just looking at the US or Europe in his arguments. He's arguing that we have a global savings glut for sure, and this probably started coming out of emerging countries after the financial crises that they suffered in the past decade, going back to 1997-98 for Asia, whereas a precautionary measure, a form of self-insurance, countries would accumulate their own reserves, and they have led to a reduction in the cost of borrowing in terms of global interest rates. But Ben Bernanke's argument is that we can get out of this by foreign investment and trade. The other feature that we're seeing at the moment is that there is a lot of macroeconomic policy uncertainty. Our old policies don't work anymore, and so we're seeing some quite dramatic policy changes in many countries. We've seen negative interest rate policies in about 5 countries or central banks, which is obviously very different to what we've experienced in the past. And so the consequences of those are not quite clear. Okay, so there are all the risks and the downsides and what's happening amongst the countries that we have traditionally been involved with in terms of investment. The bright spot, I guess, for outbound investment is in the call for infrastructure investment. There's a lot of scope there in being able to, for example, facilitate urbanisation in countries such as China and a lot of the other countries in our region. I'd be thinking of India and also Indonesia. And we're basically in the middle of this region where emerging countries are now 50% of global GDP, and we have the major economy transitioning from into more manufacturing rather than importing resources for buildings. So there's a transition there that we're seeing. There are also a lot of risks associated with some of these countries as well, especially in China in terms of the financial sector issues that we've seen some of last year and the way that they spill over to other countries, and also that will affect the investment climate as well. But I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Renee. Andrew, do you want to bring this conversation a bit more focused on Asia?
Yep, sure. So let me just sort of set some macro comments and then talk a little bit about what I think the issues are that hold us back. If we think about where is the Australian economy at the moment, we look at a region where in about 15 years' time, so just a decade and a half from now, our economic modelling suggests that 4 of the world's 5 largest economies, if you measure that in purchasing power parity terms, will be in this region. So China, which is already the largest economy in the world in purchasing power parity terms today, Japan, India, and many of you will be really surprised to know that Indonesia comes in at number 5 there. So only the US interrupting Asian dominance of that list of 5. At the end of that 15 years, Australia won't be a G20 economy anymore. In fact, we may not even retain our place in the G30. So we have to think about what does that mean. These are really quite profound changes for Australia. It is a structural shift which is happening in the world economy. It's not a cyclical shift, and I think this is a distinction that very few Australian firms have, and I think Australians have truly come to terms with that reality. On the other side, 6 of our top 10 trading partners are in the region, so we're very comfortable trading with Asia. But if you look at our outbound investment, our foreign direct investment is a reasonable measure of that. At the end of 2015, Australian firms had invested $60 billion in New Zealand. This is a country of 4.5 million people and a growth rate of 2.5%, let's say 3% in a good year. In all of the 10 ASEAN countries, that number was 38. So this is a region of 620 million people plus growing at more than 5%. That's 38. If you then add up China, Japan, India and Korea and add that to those 10 ASEAN countries, you still come up to less than $60 billion. So it does pose the question, I think, as why. In my experience, few Australian companies and boards will disagree with the basic economic thesis that Asia is big, it's getting bigger. And therefore there is opportunity there. Many will disagree about the pace at which change may occur. Some may have views on whether whether Asia can actually reach the potential that I've described there for various political, structural and other reasons. But there's generally agreement that Asia is quite large. But most companies, I think, really struggle with the idea of getting at that investment opportunity. How do we do it? And what is the problem here? It fundamentally, I think, comes down to our ability to manage risk. There is no question that investing in Asia is not a risk-free proposition. Investment is never a risk-free proposition, but there are, for sure, plenty of risks in the region. And when I say Asia, I'm talking about a very diverse region as well here. So, Singapore, number 1 on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, all the way through to Myanmar, which is around about 177 out of 187 countries. And there's everything in between. So it's a very diverse region, culturally, business-wise, religions, languages, just about every political system that the earth knows resides in our region. So the way that risk is managed in the region is very different to the way that we manage risk in Australia. So the rule of law is our fundamental fallback backup for our how we think about risk. In the region, often things called relationships are really, really important, and many of us don't appreciate just how important they are. Why? Because the institutions are not as strong, the rule of law is not as predictable, and so Asians rely on relationships. So fundamentally, I think there's a very broad range of reasons, and we can talk in more detail about those in a moment, but there is a very broad range of reasons why Australian companies find it difficult to invest in the region. But I think when you really boil it down, we don't understand Asia, we don't understand the culture and the business environment in Asia, and as a consequence, we're not very comfortable. And that comfort, that degree of discomfort, is actually quite significant. And that means that many companies just simply do not take the risk of investing in Asia. We've had 25, 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth in this country. There hasn't been the need to take the risk. But if you believe the economic predictions that I outlined at the beginning, and Renee in her chapter has talked about some of these as well, I think we have to seriously start considering what it is we need to do as a country to change our Asian capabilities, our language skills, our understanding of Asia, our cultural understanding. Because if we don't, we'll be consigned to trading with Asia. We will not be taking the opportunity of trading inside Asia.
Thank you, Andrew. Craig, you're going to talk to us about how you see some of the solutions to this
conundrum. Sure. If I could draw together Renee's and Andrew's comments, Renee's talking about a world, or at least a rich country world, where it is conceivable that we'll have very low growth for a very long period of time. It's not a business cycle, but structurally that the developed world will grow slowly because of this slowdown in productivity as we're journeying through the digital age and population ageing and a whole bunch of so-called headwinds. And that is sort of the bad news, but the good news is that there are two other groups of countries, emerging economies, which are growing pretty rapidly, and obviously China, India and Indonesia in our own region are very good examples of that. So for businesses and for national economies in the developed world that are seeking to increase their income, you would look to those countries naturally. Say, wow, we can do 3% and we're really pleased with it, and they're very disappointed if they do 5%, but they're really looking 6.5%, 7.5% in the case of India. And then there's a third group which we won't discuss today, which are the really least developed countries, the poor countries of Africa in particular, where if we were having this discussion in 10 years' time, we'd be talking about the phenomenal transformation that's going on in Africa. So, but let's put that to one side, because their growth rates, however, while they are very, very risky countries, their growth rates will probably dwarf those even of China and India and Indonesia and the like. Andrew, I think, made a very important point when he said, well, Asia's not Asia. Oils ain't oils and Asia's not Asia. When we're thinking about opportunities to generate incomes, we would think for countries such as Australia, we should be thinking very differently about Singapore compared with Myanmar. Yet they're all in Asia. I remember Ross Garnaut, almost 20 years ago when I set up a forum called 2020 Vision, he was one of the first speakers at it. We're perilously close to 2020 now, and this was in the early 1990s, and he said people in Asia do not think of themselves as Asian, and they do not think of a place called Asia. So this is an external view of these countries, and I think it's really important in the analysis that we've done here for CEDA to understand that there are vastly different sets of institutional frameworks and so on in these different countries. But it does answer this question. For more than 200 years in Australia, when we talk about foreign investment, we've always talked about inbound investment. We've always talked about our inability to save enough to fund the investments, on a vast continent like this to improve living standards and generate incomes. But we have never really had a proper conversation about outbound investment, and that's what this is about, to try to recognise the limitations of growth in the developed world, but to take opportunities as they arise or as we can see them in the developing world and even later, as I said, in the least developed world. So what do we do in terms of justifying an argument for such outbound investment? So in my chapter, I started thinking about, well, where is this appropriate? Again, let's not just have a blanket view that every company that is interested in the region must invest, make big outbound investments. One of our biggest exports is tourism. Well, what outbound investment we're not going to be, as far as I know, breaking up bits of Uluru and selling it into China or India or anywhere else, breaking off bits of coral from the Great Barrier Reef. There's not much of an obvious justification if we're doing tourism here to have a big outbound investment in other countries. Similarly, for the resources boom that's now tapered off, do we really need in CEDA to think of policy recommendations for BHP and Rio? I think they probably can look after themselves. So we're not really thinking of those sorts of companies and those sorts of sectors. So what are we thinking about? There's a very clear one, and it's one of the sort of big areas of opportunity for us, and that is agribusiness, premium quality food production, very safe, reliable, and therefore very high priced. I had a conversation with someone at the Australian Embassy in Beijing in 2013 when we were conceiving of, you know, this premium market. And I said, oh, so this is the limitations of economics, Rod. I said, so the idea would be that, you know, we grow, for example, the premium beef here in Australia, the poor animals slaughtered, cut up into 4 pieces and then taken off to China for where, you know, cheap labour, inexpensive labour would then prepare it all into chops and steaks and things. And they said, oh no. And they explained, it's all got to be packaged here. It's got to have, you know, an authentic Australian label on it so that it's the ridgy-dig stuff. And so I thought then about, well, what sort of investments do we need in this food sector? Because we're not really thinking about supply chains here. We're thinking about doing the whole thing here and then getting it marketed. Now, outfits like Alibaba and those online platforms are going to be incredibly important there. So what does make sense? And it made me think for this study, if Australian agribusiness companies had some sort of investment in, say, Shanghai, probably most people wouldn't notice. It's a big international city. And they go, oh, yeah, okay, down that laneway there's some investment, you know, by some Australian firm. But if they did it in Shenyang up in the north, or in Chengdu or Chongqing or some of the other cities that have got 2 or 3, 4 million people, the advantage of that, I think, is that it's really important in a country like China to have good relations, not only with the national government, who chances are probably don't even know you exist, but if they do, it's good to have some sort of mentor or sponsor there, but provincial governments and local, very local governments. And if you make a commitment to that local community, it will be recognised and rewarded. Now, we don't have the same law and order system and all the other very strong institutions there. I'm just saying it's not a bad thing if a provincial governor or a mayor or a vice mayor or a deputy vice mayor thought, well, good on these Australians, they're actually here and they're helping us. They're actually doing something for us. And I think that's the single strongest theme I can think of as a justification for outbound investment into the region, because the goodwill, whether it's in China or Myanmar or Kazakhstan or places like that, that can be generated from that sort of investment are great. Now there's, Rod and I were having talk, personal services, healthcare, aged care, same sort of thing. You know, you can't just export. I don't even know how you export those from Australia. They've got to be done locally, and those relationships developed over time. Then you get the protection, you know, that you might need against intellectual property theft and so on. So that's the area that I think is really important. My role really, I suppose, was to think of government policy settings that could be tailored to accommodate these sorts of opportunities. And the institutions that come to mind, and the relevant ones are Austrade and EFIC, the Export Finance and Insurance Corporation. When I was Trade Minister, I actually was involved in reviews of both of those. I won't take any time on this, I'll just summarise. For Austrade, it had lots of operations in the US, and I wondered why. Because you think, well, maybe there's private providers in the US who could actually tell you how to set up a business in the United States of America. If there isn't, then that would be a massive market failure. But the real market failures are much more likely to be in the emerging and frontier markets. Think of a small business and the business owner's trying to work out how to get into an emerging market they don't understand, even the government structure, the law, the regulatory structure, how the legal system operates, and so on. Wouldn't that be an appropriate justification for having Austrade involved? And obviously the economic concept is market failure, where the information that required overwhelms any individual business, but you could collect enough information and then make that available to all small and medium enterprises. Well, we did that. We actually, Kim Beazley was very upset with us, but we closed an office in Houston and opened offices, I think one in Kazakhstan, we actually opened one in Colombia and another one in Shenyang, actually. But it was consistent with that philosophy. Similarly, the Export Market Development Grant Scheme, which is administered by Austrade, you could go to the US on 7 different trips and still get part of your costs paid. There was almost a revolt, but I cut that back to 5. Still a lot, I think, and increased that in Asia to 7. So since then, since I left in 2013, I think that general philosophy of market failure has guided both Austrade and the program, one of the key programs it implements, the Export Market Development Scheme. Now for EFIC, I had a lot of grief with EFIC because I think export finance means that's the funding of export activities. But what they were doing was they explained to me this notion of a market gap. And a market gap is actually when the banks will give you so much money but not quite enough. And that's when EFIC comes in. And I said, well, what's the justification of that? Why won't the banks give you quite enough? And they say, oh, well, you don't understand the idea of market gap. And I said, I think I do now. And so I thought we'd unleash the Productivity Commission on them. And it came back and said there's a justification where there's genuine market failure, but not for just funding. What they were actually funding was large gas producing projects here in Australia. So the recommendations coming out of that were that they concentrate their efforts on small and medium enterprises, again in emerging and developing markets. I had a look at their annual report for this study, and the proportion that it's going to larger businesses is actually growing. So I think that EFIC have not seen the merit of the concept of market failure, but no doubt will, if you want to spend any time with them, explain to you what market gap really means. So I think that they are actually, in terms of numbers, increasing their engagement with SMEs. That's what the Productivity Commission said. But in terms of the bulk of their business, it still remains with large businesses and is projected to remain so in the future. So I think, Rod, that's an area where a genuine policy refocus is warranted.
Thank you very much. We're now open for questions from the floor. There's somebody walking around with a mic. Have we got a first question from somewhere? Jonathan, Productivity Commission jumps into the fray.
Hope EFIC's not here.
That better?
No, try this one.
That's better, yeah. So this is not a question about EFIC, but I think it's a question directed principally to you, Craig. And I've heard that there are risk factors associated with investment into Asia. It varies from country to country. And we have investment state dispute settlement in our trade agreements and investment agreements. They've come under quite a lot of criticism vis-a-vis what they mean for Australia. I'm wondering whether you have any views on the role that such processes have or forums have for dealing with such or some of those risks. Thanks.
Do I what? Investment State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, is a provision that is inserted into lots of trade agreements that allows a company from one of the countries that's signed up to the trade agreement to sue the government of the other country. And this, the government that would be sued is sued on the basis of an allegation of indirect expropriation, which means broadly regulatory decisions that adversely affect the profit streams of those companies. It has to be in some way discriminatory, so if there's a general increase in tax, that could not be the subject of it. But if an environmental impact assessment was against a particular project, that could be subject to ISDS. And those provisions, just to be fair, there is one saving clause in these agreements which says, except in rare circumstances, these provisions do not apply in areas such as health and education and so on. Problem is the clause at the beginning, which is except in rare circumstances, because every company says, you know what, my circumstances are really rare. I'm opposed to them, and the reason I'm opposed to them is that I read a very enlightening Productivity Commission report of November 2010, and as Trade Minister I took to Cabinet in April 2011 a proposition that we not have investor-state dispute settlement provisions. It seems to me that based on the Productivity Commission analysis, it said that it could not see any particular benefits in this, but there were costs associated with it, and the party that I represented at the time did not have it in any further trade agreements. That was the reason that we could not complete the Korea Australia Free Trade Agreement, and it was completed about 1 month after the government changed, because the new government said, yeah, that's fine. So long and short of it, I don't think there's any evidence that they're good, and quite a lot of evidence that they're bad. The final point I'll make, and I'll shut up then, is these issues are not determined in a court of law, but by panels that are set up from time to time. So if there are lawyers or more particularly judges or friends of judges, they probably would say that's not a very good system either.
Thank you for that. Yes, right in this corner.
Hello, Louise McGrath from the Australian Industry Group. I know the theme for today is very much Asia, and you said we're not here to think of policies to support BHP, but I think if we think of BHP in Rio and Chile, we can see the advantage of supporting the big whales, because Chile has over 200 Australian companies invested in countries simply because they've made sales into Rio and to BHP. So perhaps anyone in the panel might like to comment on the role that we could have in supporting these large companies to take these value-added chains into Asia.
Andrew, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, well, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, a couple of observations. As Craig pointed out, our export industries have been very dominant. So we have a natural resource, which is hard rock minerals and agricultural products. They lend themselves to putting on boats in bulk and sending them to the region. But as the region changes, consumption grows, that means services grow, and I would venture to suggest that probably 9 out of 10 people in this room today are probably employed by the services sectors. So Australia's actually really good at services, and these are things which these are Asian countries, as they go through the economic transition, generally require. If you look at intra-Asian trade, which I think is a really important measure, intra-Asian trade is about $2.8 trillion, and that is only short of the European Union, which is around about $3.4 trillion. If you aggregated it, it would be the second largest trading bloc in the world, and it is fast catching up to Europe. So for Australian firms, I think, Craig, used the words that they're being where the customers are. You have to be where the customers are. If consumption and services is what they're buying, then Australian firms will not be able to export those services. They have to be there. So I think the role that large companies play then in these global value chains and the opportunity that it presents for small, medium businesses is incredibly important, because the presence of those big companies in the region supports the presence of smaller Australian companies. In fact, many of our most innovative technologies, know-how in mining, in engineering services and those kinds of things, agricultural services are held by small businesses.
Renee, did you want to say anything about that as well? Just the potential for clustering, I think, is the fact that we invest now largely in the developed economies. Is that just an accident of our cultural history, and as BHP goes to Chile, then generates a whole lot of other companies following their major client? once we get somebody going to Asia, will we actually get a flow-on effect? Is that, I know you're an expert in these sorts of issues of how economies are linked in these sorts of ways. Your thoughts on that sort of transmission of investment?
I think it's a function of our natural resources, and the countries that are demanding, most of them are developing and emerging countries, so it's a natural place for us to start with our linkages there. So it makes sense then from then on to move into other areas, but I obviously we need to do more to support businesses who want to take those steps in terms of understanding the local environments and things to make that work well.
Rod, I just wonder if,
Go, Craig.
picking up on this point, I certainly understand the sort of spin-off businesses, the SMEs, you know, that gravitate around a large corporation, but I'm going to say something designed to get people thinking, and that means I'm not asking you to agree with me, but a proposition, and that is supply chains, I think, are on the way out. You know, we're only just getting used to them, and I wouldn't be surprised in 20 years' time if the idea of offshoring some activities in order to chase low-cost labour becomes pretty obsolete fairly quickly, because low wage costs will not be a big locational determinant in the future. With artificial intelligence and robotics, I think what's going to happen is, as Rod said, and we're bouncing off each other, being close to a final market will be really important, but we're seeing reshoring, we're seeing back office, you know, operations that we're all going to Bangalore. They're kind of not necessarily coming back to developed countries, but they're everywhere. You know, so people bid for these services, and it's a global auction for these services, and they're not location specific. So, you know, if I were a corporate, I wouldn't be thinking, how can I reduce my labour costs for a product that I'm going to sell by going overseas in search of cheap labour, because technology will beat you.
So Renee, you said at the start that there's not enough research in this area. If somebody here was going to fund some research for you, what would you actually want the money for?
I should have thought more about this one. Anyone out? Just if you have ideas, come and talk to me. So when I first, as I said, I started looking around to see what other people had done, and there was very little work that had been done. The most recent sort of substantial piece that I have found was published in 2002 by the Productivity Commission, where they'd surveyed 200 firms about why they would invest in another country, what were the factors determining that investment. And obviously a lot has changed since then, and nothing else has been really written. I do have a research grant at the moment, joint with DFAT, trying to quantify the effects of economic diplomacy, like the location of embassies, consulates, and Austrade on trade and, as it turns out, foreign investment. So that's a project that's in its early stages. Yeah, but it was really quite striking that there is nothing being written in this area, and there has to be a lot of questions that need to be answered, and I'm sure you've got a million of them that you could suggest as well.
Yes, Hamilton.
Perhaps continuing on that discussion, how well prepared are we, both organisations, both government, both to the structural shift that Andrew spoke about in Indonesia in the next 15 years? We know China, we're getting to know India, but then we've got Indonesian. How do you think that we're understanding this and we're getting prepared as a country for a new trading partner to emerge the size of Indonesia?
Well, I think Indonesia is the biggest underdone relationship, and it's so ironic. It's, apart from Papua New Guinea, it's our nearest neighbour. The language barriers are not great. The cultural barriers are significant but not very large. It's got, what's the population, 245 million?
No.
245,
200.
260 million, 260 million. You know, growing very, very strongly after the end of the resources boom based on infrastructure investment. you know, a great economy could be a great neighbour, and we've kind of looked right over the top of it. And good on us for the interest we've shown in China. You know, I think Australia's being rewarded for that, but to have peered over the top of Indonesia, which in many senses, culturally and in every other way, would seem easier, is amazing. So I would think in the next 20 years, there'll be a lot more activity in embassies, Austrade and all that sort of stuff to just help ease people into investment in Indonesia, and it could be, you know, a very big story in the coming decade or two.
Renee, you want to comment on that?
So I think you would actually be surprised how much work places like ANU, my university, does with Indonesia, and DFAT as well. So we've been involved in the last 5 years in a program called the Knowledge Sector Initiative, where we're part of an international consortium who are helping the Indonesians improve their knowledge sector, their policy making, and that funding has just been extended for another 5 years for $65 million, I think, and we're working very closely with particular groups trying to generate evidence-based policy making and placing more emphasis on the need for procuring research when you need it to answer questions that need to be answered in Indonesia. We've educated so many former ministers and senior officials through ANU, and also people who are now in businesses. I think that we probably overlook those people as resources in helping us to actually invest in these countries, or even just in terms of exporting, but they're all there. I think we just don't mobilise them very well.
In one of my previous jobs, I was at Commonwealth Bank, and I guess most people don't know Commonwealth Bank's got 5,000 employees in Indonesia. Yep, I just think there's a lot of activity going on which is probably not appreciated. And similarly, our research institute is working with the Indonesian regulators and the Indonesian Ministry of Finance, helping them to write new laws for Indonesia. So I think there's actually quite a lot of probably not headline. It's not BHP going and opening Escondida. It's actually lots and lots of much more lower level interaction, but I think it's quite strong. I feel it's strong. Andrew, you've got a different view?
I'm going to disagree.
Go
on. I don't disagree with the idea that Indonesia is an enormous opportunity, but if you look at our direct investment in Indonesia, it is less than $9 billion. Most of that goes into the resources industries. Indonesia is not one of our top 10 trading partners, despite the 250 million people that Craig referred to. Indonesia will become the next $1 trillion economy in our region. That is nearly 2/3 of an Australian economy. In 1998, the Indonesian economy was just under $100 billion. We have completely missed it. We were asleep when it happened. So I think we've actually got a lot of work to do to catch up with most of these countries that you've referred to. We're a long way behind.
You had some statistics about education, I think, as well, didn't you, or language?
I think that's right. I mean, if you take language as a litmus test, and I know it's an emotive subject, but the number of high school students who studied Indonesian last year, certainly in my home state, New South Wales, was 4 times fewer than those who studied Italian. So go figure that.
And if that's not worrying enough, the number of Australian students studying Indonesian now, and Indonesia is quite an easy language, is smaller than the number who were studying it in 1990.
Yeah.
Correct. So I actually think we've, as a country, got some really profound questions to ask ourselves. If you go back to that proposition that I put, that 4 of the world's 5 largest economies will be in this region, China, Japan, India, and Indonesia, yet none of those languages feature anywhere close to the top of our list of languages. It's Italian, Greek, Latin, French, German. I mean, really?
France is very fashionable at the moment. Sorry, there's a lady here, and then you're next, yeah?
My name is Rohini Kapatat from KPMG. My question is to Andrew Parker. Andrew, you sort of mentioned that the fundamental problem, and I quite agree, is our ability to manage risk. our ability to understand the risk of doing business in Asia, and then our ability to manage it, which comes from the inability to really understand the risk in the first place. How do you suggest that we're going to actually be successful in changing the Australian mindset? Because I think this all comes back to mindset. We're hearing a fairly grim picture right now. Our starting mindset has been, in the last couple of decades, where do we ship the next container of homemade product in Asia? How do we shift that mindset to where do we need to invest in Asia?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's going to be a very long process, but I would just make a couple of observations. The Australian Council of Learned Academies, ACOLA, published a report last year. It was probably about 12 months ago now, and it looked at the diasporas in Australia. So Chinese and Indian diasporas in Australia were used as proxies for that sort of broader region we call Asia. But one of the observations that really jumped out at me was the number of Asian cultural background directors on our ASX 200 board. So there were 8 of our 200 companies. So that's 4%. Now, ACOLA also suggested that around about 17% of our population identifies as having an Asian cultural background. So there is an enormous disconnect between what our community looks like and what our boardrooms look like. And I know it's the same in our firm. I'm sure it's the same in your firm and most other professional services firms, and probably all of the companies. The people who are in charge of making the investment decisions, in managing these decisions, are actually not fundamentally of an Asian cultural background, and I would suggest that those are actually the people that are best placed to manage the kind of risks that I've highlighted.
Next question was at the front here, yes.
Catherine Taylor, Austrade. Andrew, just in relation to a couple of things. Firstly, what then does success look like in terms of investment into Indonesia or any of the markets that you've spoken about over the next 10 and 20 years? And also, I must admit, not being across the detail of the report yet, but having just been in market with Austrade myself and for quite a length of time, looking at outbound investment can take many shapes and forms. And one of the important things about success in overseas markets is the agility and ability to, be flexible and as the opportunity changes. So assume that we're not talking about outbound investment strictly in terms of bricks and mortar and number of people on the ground, because there's a whole lot of collaboration and investment into, jointly designed programs, etc. That is, seems to be on the increase in certain pockets of Asia. So just your thoughts on those two things, thanks.
Yeah, look, so I think that's a fair point, and the other aspect to that, I guess, is just when you think about services industries, they are generally will be less capital intense than, say, a manufacturing industry. So I do accept that there are some aspects of foreign direct investment as a measure which is a bit crude. But if you look at it in comparison to other countries, so Australia's outbound direct investment is about 32% of our GDP. That is pretty much on the G20 average. Our outbound foreign direct investment doubled in the last decade. That's pretty much consistent with the global experience. So Australia doesn't have an aversion to investing outside of Australia generally. Our issue is we don't invest that money in the high growth countries in Asia where we trade. We invest that money in North America and New Zealand and Europe. I think that's fundamentally where the problem lies. Not again to say that FDI is the only measure we could look at.
From the research that I did, we're not talking about huge amounts of investment. So if you were, say, in food processing or something, you're not going to have the abattoirs for the reasons that I mentioned in that country, but it certainly helps to have some sort of physical presence with some people. Now that just might be an office. I'm not thinking of how do you pour billions of dollars of Australian savings or, international funds to get this massive return on the investment that you've made. It's just the investment that is required to do the job rather than trying to maximise the quantum of it.
Someone else? Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Just building on what you said, Renee, and Andrew and Craig as well, are there things we can learn from other countries that do have a higher rate of investment into Asia? Similar economies, the Dutch or the Brits or the Canadians that we could benefit from as we look to, make our mark a bit more heavily in Asia in the next 15 years.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm not really an expert in looking at the individual country characteristics, so I don't really have much to add to that.
Okay, Andrew?
I'm happy to, yeah. So I think there's a couple of things. There are some uniquely Australian cultural aspects of what we do, I think, that distinguish us as not as clever investors. We have a very peculiar focus on short-term returns. Because we come in from a country where generally things happen relatively quickly, we can achieve generally fairly decent returns here in Australia, and so we take that into a foreign country and expect everything to work like we work. If you look at the way that I think particularly the Europeans have done much better, they're much more patient, they're longer term thinkers about investment, and then you look at the Japanese and Koreans, they think much longer term. But those that are more like us, I guess, in terms of our heritage, the Europeans and North Americans, I don't know what it is, but they're much more patient. I think the other thing which is maybe is very peculiarly Australian is this separation of government and business. In Australia, we generally, as a business community, think as long as government stays away from us, we don't care what they do, just keep them away. In Asia, the interaction of business and government is so closely related that to get stuff done, you have to work with government. The Americans are much better at that. Even the Brits, if you look at their chambers of commerce in the region, they kill us. Why? Because their companies and their diasporas, their expats, tend to congregate around those business chambers. Australians, we don't fund those business chambers. We have very little time for them. And I would suggest, and you guys are from Austrade, you probably know this better than me, but I'd suggest that the interaction and the level of use of Australian companies of your service and the service of the embassies is pretty sporadic. You get some that are believers, but there are plenty that never call on you guys.
I want to have a go at that, Craig, before you. Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I really think that we should be looking a lot more at how the Asian multinationals deal with into other Asian countries. You see the big Thai food multinationals spreading all across Asia. Very, very interesting. And I think you see lots of examples throughout Asia when the Taiwanese banks heavily through the Chinese banking system. So I think there are a lot of Asian multinationals who are worth studying much more closely about how they deal with these sorts of problems. Sorry, Craig, your turn.
And I'll bet they are doing what Andrew was talking about, and that is effectively investing in relationships with governments, with authorities, with regulators and so on. That's why my answer to the earlier, I offered a suggestion that these aren't large amounts. It's not building lots of bricks and mortar, but it's building relationships. And I think that is true. In Australia, we don't think of that way. Think of that. Why would you want to build a relationship with the federal government, where you're dealing with them all the time? They don't want to deal with you, you don't want to deal with them, and everybody's happy. But, in the countries that we're talking about, I think that's really important. One attribute that I've found as Trade Minister that Australian businesses have compared with some other businesses from some other countries, most particularly the United States, is they kind of like us. They like Australians, and they don't think that they're there just to make a quick buck and get out whatever they possibly can. They think Australians are interested in all sorts of relationships, not only with government but with business partners and the broader community. So we are probably pretty welcome, and there is some friction in relationships, I think, between the US in particular in China, where the US says, well, they're just going to rip off our intellectual property, and the Chinese are saying, well, they're just here to rip us off. And so it's not, you know, obviously this is a sweeping generalisation, but I think that there's the starting point for those engagements is not as positive as the starting point between an Australian business and people in China.
How are we doing here, over here?
Andrew Tulloch from Austrade. I'm just wondering, Renee, perhaps if in your research or other research you're aware of, has anyone looked at the impact of Australian educated alumni in Asia? I mean, there's hundreds of thousands now of people moving up corporate ladders in Asian organisations that were educated here. Is there any research that indicates whether that's resulting in more international transactions, including Australian investment, perhaps partnering or investing in Asian companies?
Not that I know of, but I haven't looked specifically for that, but I'm pretty sure if we had that information, then ANU would be very happy, because we educate a lot of those people and we don't know where they are.
Yeah, I can help with that question. The short answer is we don't know who they are. And similarly, which I think is really importantly, the Australians who were born here that have gone to Asia to work, we have no idea who those people are or where they are or how many of them there are. Going back to the question over here, that's a real contrast to, say, the Americans and the Europeans, who have much stronger connection to those alumni networks.
Now, Megan, you haven't said anything. You were one of the authors of this report. Is there something that you'd like to add to the conversation?
Thank you. I think we've touched on all the major issues around why there's not more investment into Asia. And Andrew pointed out also with the short-termism that, you know, generally speaking, we suffer from a bit in Australia. But, I mean, we've looked at various facets, and I think we just, touched on it then, that there is also no way of actually even measuring Australian expats going out and working in the region. We have some roundabout numbers, but we basically lose visibility of them when they go to work in the region, and also are we valuing them when they're coming back to work in Australia as well, and building on those networks. And until we fundamentally shift the way we look at some of those issues and we value that kind of expertise and make sure that it's embedded in companies and it's creating impact in the way that companies here are working, then we're actually kind of shortchanging ourselves. So there needs to be a bit of a change in mindset with the Australian business community around some of these fundamental issues.
Yeah, I certainly saw that in a big corporation, that you'd have somebody come back who'd been running the business in Vietnam, and they'd find it really hard to get a placement in Australia because they hadn't been working on lending or investment or something. And so that broad skills of operating there tend to get lost. And so I do think that corporations have failed to some extent to build on their own investment. So I take that point. Now, we're not going to have time for any more questions. Now I can say, would you please join me in thanking our panel and our other presenter, non-presenters, other chapter writer for the work that they've done. Thank you very much.